record. All right, so we're going to get started, and people will join as they move along. So I'm really happy to welcome you, Selina. You know, we had that great discussion about diversity and inclusion last week, and this is like so perfect to carry on from that. Oh, there's Ingrid, great. You know, the focus last week really was on, you know, anti-Black racism, but of course the issue, and Courtney did talk about, you know, the Indigenous community. And so, you know, we know that, you know, the issue is way bigger than the Black community. Let me just mute everybody. People, you could mute. That's great. So, Selina, you have to unmute on your own. I have to ask you to unmute, so I can't do it for you. So I'm going to turn it over to you. If you would do your introduction, you know, your background, whatever it is you'd like to say.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
I'm just gonna, thanks for having me, everybody. I'm just gonna share the presentation and I'll do my intro as part of that. So hopefully this works. And slideshow. There we go. All right, can everybody see that okay? Just a thumbs up. Nodding is perfect, thank you. So Tausi, Dishnakasham Selina. Hello, my name is Selina. You just heard a tiny bit of my language, which is Michif. I am Métis, originally from northwestern Saskatchewan, a Métis town called Meadow Lake. But I've lived in and around Toronto for pretty much my whole life. So thanks for letting me join you. Merci is thank you in my language. I realize that the title of this session is Blueprint for HR Professionals to Grow an Indigenous Workforce. And while I promise I get to some slides and share some thoughts, and of course there's room for discussion around that today, I think it's important to take a step back and actually I'm going to start the conversation with a bit of information about Indigenous peoples. When we say Indigenous peoples in Canada, who are we talking about? And I mean, if you want to, if you and your organization have a goal of growing an Indigenous workforce, it's really important you have an understanding of who we are. Now, I also need you to know that I am in no way an HR professional. What I have learned as an Indigenous employee, as well as a hiring manager in the public sector. So I've worked for 4 different governments, 4 different levels of government for the last 24 years. I started my career as a research scientist with the federal government, and now I'm the director of the Indigenous Affairs Office at the City of Toronto. And I also will say, if you don't like this presentation, then please blame my friend and coach, Ingrid. She helped facilitate connecting Deborah and I. Okay, so art, I find art is often a really great way to start learning about Indigenous peoples. Most of us, Indigenous and non, are very visual. So I'm just sharing a few art pieces to get us started. The 3 pieces and the artists that I'll mention here, that you can see here, are pretty famous Indigenous artists in Canada. So number 1 is a piece by Norval Morisseau. He was an Anishinaabe man from Bingui, Nayashki, Anishinaabeg, or otherwise known as Sandpoint First Nations. We can talk about the anglicizing of Indigenous words later on. It's called Woodland Floral. The second one is by one of my favorite artists, Métis artist, Christy Belcourt. She's Métis from Lac Sainte Anne in Alberta. She has grown up, like me, in Ontario, raised in Ontario her life. And this is called Our Lives Are the Land. And you can't tell in this picture, but a standard style of Métis art is dots. So this picture would be millions of tiny dots painted to make the image that you see. And then last but not least, number 3 is called Family Gathering Whale Meat, and it's by a really famous Inuk artist named Annie Pagutik, originally from Cape Dorset in Baffin Island. She lived in Ottawa, Ontario. All right. So, who are the Indigenous peoples in Canada, at least as were identified in the Constitution? So, the term Indigenous or Aboriginal, those are two umbrella terms used to describe Indigenous folks in the country, and there's three recognized groups of Indigenous people, and that's First Nations, Métis like myself, and Inuit. Language matters. There's always challenges with umbrella terms. So I always tell people, if you're working with or engaging with Indigenous people, ask how they like to be referred to. Within First Nations, there's a huge diversity, and I'll get to that. We tend to identify with where we're from. So when I introduce myself, like I did with you, I tell you where I'm from in Saskatchewan, because the land and the territory matters. And it gives, that's how traditionally we just always identified ourselves, where we're from. And then where we work always comes secondary. So you may be familiar, and you could still see the term Indian used. One of the federal pieces of legislation that governs First Nations is called the Indian Act, but generally speaking, we use the term First Nations over Indian. And as of late, there's been more of a movement to use the umbrella term Indigenous over Aboriginal. Of course, you will still see the term Aboriginal, and in organizationally in the Constitution as well. So there's not necessarily a right or wrong, which is why I always ask. I encourage people to ask what they should or should not use. And you will find that a lot of us, the last point here is, people want to identify with their particular nation. So they'll say they're Anishinaabe, or I would say I'm Métis, but they also will want to describe, again, that area that they're from. They could be from Curve Lake First Nation, which is a First Nation reserve just outside of Peterborough. And I should have said at the intro, I mean, I'm happy to take questions at any point, but I have maybe 5 slides that talk about Indigenous peoples, 5 or 6. And then I pause, and then I start talking about Indigenous recruitment and retention. So there's also, I have built in some space before we switch topics if people want to ask questions or share any comments. But I'll do my best to watch, but definitely there is a pause in a few slides in case there's
Selina, don't worry, I'll monitor the chat for you, so don't
Perfect.
concern yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. I'm not very good at multitasking. Okay. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because it really identifies who are Indigenous peoples in Ontario. So I told you, there's First Nations, there's Métis and Inuit, but there's a huge diversity amongst First Nations. And so when somebody identifies as First Nations, they may be identifying as O-Mishkego or O-Mishkegowak or Cree. The Mishkegowak or Cree are in Ontario, span basically from the west coast of James Bay to Churchill River in northern Manitoba. So many of these communities are very remote and are only accessible by air, or in the winter there's ice roads. And as well, we'll go, I started at the top of the circle, we'll go clockwise. Lenape, also known as Munsee or Delaware, they're span everywhere from, there's a lot of Lenape in New York City and upstate New York, all the way into southern Ontario and southwestern Ontario. And the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, this is where you may have heard of the 6 nations. And so the Haudenosaunee Nation is actually comprised of 6 confederated nations: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Tuscarora, and the Seneca. Did I say Cayuga? Yes. This is a really large group of nations. The Iroquois Confederacy that actually governs how the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois conduct themselves is considered to be one of, if not the oldest forms of democracy in the world. And both the US and Canada approached the Iroquois Confederacy when we were trying to, as a country, figure out what our constitution would look like and how we would govern ourselves. Translated, Haudenosaunee means people of the lighthouse or the longhouse. So traditionally, community members lived in longhouses that were built of cedars, and they would have multiple families living in that same longhouse. So it, in an effort to accommodate extended families and that sense of community and collective. All right, keep going. The Inuit, typically Inuit homelands in Canada are found in the very far north, so that includes Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, Yukon, as well as northern Quebec and Labrador. And if you can imagine this, these Inuit regions cover over 1/3 of Canada's landmass. So quite a huge amount, geographically speaking. And when it comes to Inuit in Ontario, Inuit folks, Inuk, live predominantly in urban centers and municipalities. And there's a really strong Inuk population in Ottawa, as well as in Toronto. Métis, like me, we are people with mixed Indigenous and European heritage who are descendants of, my ancestors were part of the fur trade. Lots of links there. The Métis have, like all of these nations, have a distinct language, distinct culture, distinct traditions. There's fiddle and jigging is very big in my community. There's also distinct governance approaches. And next, Anishinaabe. So, or you may be familiar with the term Ojibwe, that's the same. Anishinaabe, there's a lot of subcultures, I've listed them there, making it one of the largest nations in Canada. So if you're familiar with the Mississaugas, the Chippewa, the Saulteaux, Odawa, Algonquin, Potawatomi, Nipissing, and Oji Cree are all Anishinaabe people, all part of the Anishinaabe Nation. And they speak Anishinaabe-Moan, which is actually the third spoken Indigenous language in Canada. And it's really important to acknowledge that there are Indigenous communities that are no longer in Ontario. Some of these communities have either, descendants have been adopted. The Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, were very good at adopting Indigenous folks into their communities. There aren't any known living individuals left in some of those nations, and then some have been forcibly removed from the province. And so the Wendat or the Wyandot that have ties to the Toronto area are actually, they were given reserve land just outside of Montreal. So they're in Quebec in a place called Wendake. And it's an interesting, just as an aside, interesting relationship because they have such a strong traditional tie to areas in and around Toronto. They're a really important partner with the city of Toronto. And so I have regular conversations with community that are living in Quebec, but what happens in Toronto matters to them because that's part of their traditional territory. And then last but not least, and this is actually probably, dare I say, the most significant, or one of the most significant pieces of this slide, is the image in the center that represents the dish with one spoon, which is a treaty between many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. And it bound those nations together to share the territory around the Great Lakes and protect the land and water. And what the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have done with this dish with one spoon, it's still a living treaty. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples like myself, Europeans, newcomers, people fleeing the Atlantic slave trade, anyone that's come into this territory is welcomed into the dish with one spoon in the spirit of peace and friendship and respect. And the idea is that we're sharing what's here and working together in a good way. So just a few stats, if it's helpful, around Indigenous peoples in Ontario. Ontario has the largest Indigenous population in Canada with over 250,000 Indigenous people. And one thing that I don't have it on this slide, but I will emphasize, a lot of this data, these numbers are collected by the Canadian Census, and the numbers are drastically underrepresented because Indigenous folks don't tend to like to give information to the government because it hasn't served us well in the past, to put it mildly. So I know for myself, I had family and elders and knowledge keepers that said, don't fill out the census, Selina, don't tell them where you are or what you do. And so it was 2016 was the first census that I actually filled out. And so that I just share that so that you know that when you're looking at these numbers or when you're thinking of where you live, and if you want a workforce to reflect where you live, the numbers will be much lower. The numbers you're looking at will be much lower than they probably actually are. 2/3, this is also significant, 2/3 of the Indigenous population in Ontario actually live in large cities. So Toronto has the largest Indigenous population in the province, about 100,000 First Nations, Métis and Inuit, Thunder Bay, Sudbury, Ottawa as well. 70% of First Nations people live off reserve, and this is growing. It's probably closer to 80% now, and so that's really important. If you think Indigenous folks are all on those tiny postage stamp reserves around the country, we're not. We're really living all over the place in multiple, small, medium, large cities, and that also goes for Métis and Inuit who we don't have reserve communities. We aren't part of the reserve system, so it's a bit higher for Inuit and Métis living in urban centers. Okay. So I've just got a few images here that I'll speak to. There are 133 First Nations, so actual reserve communities in Ontario, and that's what the map on the left shows you. The entire province is covered with those 133 reserve communities. 1 in 4 of those reserve communities is a small remote community. I mentioned the James Bay communities. So 1 in 4 small Indigenous or reserve communities are only fly-in or ice routes in the winter. And the image on the right is of a hoop dancer, Nimiiki Asamawik, from Curve Lake First Nation, just outside of Peterborough. As I mentioned, hoop dancing is one of many styles of dance that you could see at a powwow or an Indigenous or First Nations celebration. And these two images, Métis Nation of Ontario has a long tradition of connecting our youth to our traditional waterways through the Great Lakes region. So what you see there is one of our typical Voyager canoes. It's a really, really large canoe that can fit 12 to 14 individuals, and every summer for the last number of years, well, except this summer, there's a group of Indigenous youth that traverse the path that our ancestors would have taken through the Great Lakes. And my brother had the opportunity to do that a few years ago, so he's in that canoe somewhere. And then the map on the bottom, it just shows we have a number of community councils across the province that help govern the Métis Nation of Ontario and connect with community at the local level. And then last but not least, this one image of an Inuk woman and her babe. And then the image on the left is my friend Peter Itinerwar's, his mom is got the hand drum, which is very typical, beautiful drum for Inuit. And that's his mom in the big igloo. Okay. All right, any idea of how many treaties? You can maybe hold up your hand or Deborah can see in the chat. Any idea of how many treaties there are between the Crown and First Nations in what we now call Ontario? You just throw out numbers. Nice, 325, 350.
225, Roger said.
So, so you're all somewhat right, because it really depends who you talk to. The map that I have on this slide represents 46 treaties in Ontario, but depending on who you talk to and how you define a treaty, some elders and knowledge keepers will say that there's more like 150 treaties that govern us across the province, or closer to the 46 or 50. I do have some links. I mean, I'm happy to share a PDF of this presentation, but I've got some links so you could learn a little bit more about treaties, although I'll try and at least give you some information. So treaties, as you can tell by the map, Ontario is covered with them, and they're really important because they were contracts between Indigenous people and the Crown, provisions, promises, relationships, and responsibilities really between Indigenous folks and the Crown. So when I say Crown, it's the federal and provincial government. But the challenge came because the understanding of those relationships, promises, responsibilities carried very different meanings for Indigenous people and the Crown. So the treaties were seen as instruments of relationships between autonomous people. The Indigenous folks, we viewed ourselves as having autonomy over our decisions. But when settlers came, we agreed to share the lands and resources while still maintaining our rights and ability to govern and access those resources. So for Indigenous people, treaties are really a binding legal document, and they are in law, to be honest, still binding. But not just in that legal language way that many of us would think. It's also about the tradition and the culture. The true force of the treaties was really what actually wasn't written. It was what was practiced at the time that the different treaties were made. It's the ceremony and the culture and what was understood to be happening as part of that treaty. And remembering that for most Indigenous folks, we come from a world of oral tradition, so not written. And so unfortunately, some of our perceptions got lost in the written document. And of course, there's different languages being spoken. So there's also misunderstandings of what the Crown and Indigenous people thought was happening. Understandably so, the Crown viewed the treaty making with Indigenous peoples to be more of a surrendering of rights and the land. The Crown wanted to settle across this country and saw Indigenous folks as a challenge to that settlement, and so entered into these legally binding documents, or legally binding agreements, I should say. Also, the constitutional foundation of Canada, our constitution, was built on these treaties, built on these agreements, and actually was renewed most recently in 1982, recognizing treaties as the supreme law in Canada. And today, court rulings still happening further shape the treaty relationship between the federal government especially, but also provincial governments and Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, still often ignoring Indigenous culture that really formed the understanding of those agreements. And some people understandably ask me, why do we still care about treaties? Why do they still matter today? And it's because they still are legally binding, and it's still the understanding of how we're supposed to work together. It's just that understanding is different on different sides. Honoring the treaties, especially through the lens of Indigenous communities, was a key part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action. And if you haven't heard of the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I encourage you to look it up. I do have some resources and some links in one of my last slides, and there's a link there so you can find out more information. Maybe I'll leave the treaty section by saying that the challenge really is to bridge that gap between these different perspectives of treaties, and that's no easy challenge, as you can imagine. Hundreds of years of misunderstandings. In spite of the constitutional character of treaties, the non-Indigenous people who made and implemented them tended to be, they were trying to settle the country, the province and the country, so they tended to see them as self-serving deals, versus Indigenous folks really saw them as sacred pacts and an agreement to kind of walk together in the world. And maybe we were going to walk in a different way, but we were going to walk together, and many people don't feel that treaties have been upheld in that way. Okay, here is where, oh, there we go. Here is where I can take a pause before I shift into talking about Indigenous recruitment and retention to see if there's any questions that I can try and answer.
So Ingrid had a question. Ingrid, are you able to connect? Well, let me just check. Okay, if you can, there.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Selina, that's very good that you're giving us the history lesson, but I want you to tell them why you only self-declared in 2016
Yeah.
and what your role is in Toronto and why that role was created. Because that will be important for us as HR people who have only heard about the Black people's issues and really don't understand. I see Angie nodding, really don't understand the impact, because you're actually working in an environment to help that. So could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I will. In one of the next slides, I do talk about why I did not identify. I chose not to identify for 16 years. As most of you can see, I present as white, so I'm privileged in that. And people have a lot of assumptions about what Indigenous folks look like. So I just chose not to identify until 8 years ago. So I'll touch on that in a moment. A little bit more about the work of the office. So Toronto, for a number of years, decades actually, the Indigenous community was asking the City of Toronto to establish a standalone office that could work with community, be in the municipal government to support the Indigenous community in and around Toronto, because there is such a large Indigenous community and just growing, especially youth, more and more coming to Toronto. In 2017, December of 2017, council, it was a perfect storm. The right people were together at the right time, and City Council agreed to establish a standalone office. And to be fair, at that point, there was, I think, 2 other cities in the country that had standalone Indigenous offices. Edmonton was the first, followed by Winnipeg. And since then, other cities have followed, including Toronto. The idea that you're giving dedicated resources because things need to change, and you need people to help drive that change from within. And so that is really the Indigenous Affairs Office at the City of Toronto is essentially a corporate shop. There's 30,000 or 35,000, depending on who you talk to, staff at the City of Toronto with 44 different divisions doing everything from transportation, engineering, social development, health, shelters, housing, facilities management, the whole gamut. We work with all of those divisions to try and advance truth and reconciliation and find better ways to work with Indigenous community members and organizations. So we have an external part of our job, which is working directly with community and directly with those Indigenous organizations. And then we have an internal piece, which is really just trying to be there as a support for all of those divisions who are doing very different things, but they all have a role to play with the Indigenous community in Toronto. Does that help, Ingrid?
Can you, when you say they're doing different things, like what are the types of things? First of all, does your office, do you have things that you develop, that you roll out to the whole city and all the departments, and how can you be sure that the things they're doing are meaningful and effective and all of that?
Well, I report to the top public servant in the City of Toronto, the city manager. So he is very committed to this work and makes sure that we're accountable. And of course, we're accountable to community. That's probably the foundational piece. So we'll hear from community members if they don't like what we're doing or they don't understand what we're doing, which is fair. And we also are accountable to City Council, Mayor and Council. So have to report back on how the whole city is achieving certain objectives. We're actually working to finalize what those specific objectives are, but Indigenous recruitment and retention is one of them. It's a very significant one. So I started immediately doing work on that with our People and Equity Division when I started. Yeah, so there are things that we might roll out as an office, but then there's other things that we support. We're working on Indigenous housing. Housing is a very big issue in Toronto for everyone. It's an especially big issue for Indigenous communities who are often street involved. And so how do we find adequate housing for women fleeing violence, for our elders and seniors, for men who are often homeless, as some of our street needs assessment have shown us. So those are examples of where we'll try and work with those divisions that might have the lead. And then there's sometimes where we co-lead. So economic development and culture, we're co-leading a few different initiatives. One of them is on Nathan Phillips Square. For anybody familiar with downtown Toronto, there is a very ugly, unused section of Nathan Phillips Square right outside of City Hall. And we are working with a vision of the Indigenous community led by a particular Indigenous organization in the city called Toronto Council Fire to activate that space and make it a very visible teaching and healing and learning space to honor residential and day school survivors. So there's, construction starts next year, but it's going to be quite a beautiful space. So that's just an example of working in partnership with divisions, but also supporting the community as well.
Good, thank you. And I guess you'll talk about in this section how you work and your relationship with HR and the role of HR in all of this.
Yeah, and if I don't cover anything and you have further questions, like I'm very open, but I'll share some if now's an appropriate time. And then more questions, I'm happy to take them. So I only have a few more slides, but I think I have a lot of things to talk about on each of the slides. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about in those slides, in thinking about recruitment that is inclusive Indigenous peoples, we need to think about talent acquisition, also how employees are engaged and developed, because it's great if you can get them in, but what if they don't want to stay because they don't feel supported or they don't feel safe? You'll have to take a very hard look at the culture of an organization, and that is certainly not an easy thing to do. And one of the things you'll hear me emphasize is underlying all of this, you need to understand when thinking about Indigenous recruitment and retention, one has to understand the importance of community to Indigenous employees. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So really thinking about your talent acquisition processes and approach is needed if you want to build that Indigenous workforce. And you have to think about each stage, and at least in the language I use with HR, my HR colleagues at the city, these are the stages I'm thinking about, starting with attract. So one of the first things you can and should do is engage Indigenous organizations wherever you live. Partner with these organizations to build your workforce, because they will have direct experience and direct connections to the Indigenous community in the city, a city like Toronto, for example. So in Toronto, we work closely with Misway Beak, which is the Aboriginal Employment and Training Organization, and we're working really hard to cultivate relationships, meeting every month or so to share ideas and figure out how to implement Indigenous recruitment and retention. There can still be, I'm speaking from somebody who's worked in government for a long time, but there can be, this does somewhat apply to the private sector as well. There can be, with government, there can be a very negative perception by Indigenous folks. And so I, for years, got hassled by a number of family members asking why I was working for the dark side, because government has done so many things, or the perception is government has done so many things to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit over the decades, years. So why would somebody want to go and work there? It could also be said that just because governments and or certain private sector organizations are so large, Indigenous people can have a hard time like seeing ourselves in that organization. And so you're thinking about those things when you're trying to attract. How are you writing your job ads is something definitely to consider. One of the big changes we made at the city is acknowledging lived experience as an Indigenous person, and we put that as a qualification. And not just for what I call obvious jobs, like those in the Indigenous Affairs Office, for other jobs in health, in shelters, in children's services, parks, economic development, and culture. It's really trying to capture that not everybody experience is different in different communities, and you can have somebody with lived experience as an Indigenous person that may not have a lot of credentials or letters after their name, but that doesn't mean they can't contribute in a very meaningful way to the organization. Another question to ask, where and how are you advertising your position? So if you're using only mainstream media, will that really reach Indigenous talent? And the answer is probably no. Are you working, again, with Indigenous organizations, Indigenous media, and even Indigenous offices at colleges and universities can often be a good conduit to finding good Indigenous talent. Just as a FYI, it's not, I tried to get a better image of it, so I apologize. But the bad image on this slide is for an Indigenous, it's advertising for an Indigenous stream of a very popular internship program at the Ontario government, at the Ontario Public Service. It did not always have an Indigenous stream, but in an effort to increase Indigenous recruitment, we developed an Indigenous specific marketing campaign. And that's my friend Matt, Anishinaabe man, who is also a director at the Ontario Public Service posing. He modeled as well as some other Indigenous employees. And we thought about where we advertise, again, how we got these posters out into who, because mainstream, typically non-Indigenous media, you just won't reach Indigenous candidates in the same way. So imagine you've managed, sorry, let me pause. Imagine that you've managed to attract amazing Indigenous talent. How do you assess that talent? What assessments do you set up? And of course, one of the most common ones is interviews. So what are you doing in your interviews that may create a more welcoming space for Indigenous staff? Who's on your interview panel, and what questions are you asking, and how are you assessing those answers? And I'll share some personal experiences here. So just over 2 years ago, when I was considering making the jump from the Ontario government to the City of Toronto, I really wasn't sure I wanted to take the job. I knew how long the Indigenous community had been asking for this office, and I was concerned that the office was going to be a ticky box exercise and not actually empowered to make the change. And I didn't want to be part of that. But I was willing to give it a try. I applied, so obviously I was willing to throw my hat in the ring and see what happened. But I went, when I was invited to interview, I went to the interviews. And the first interview I had, when I walked in, I immediately recognized 2 Indigenous community members who happened to be staff at the City of Toronto, sitting as part of that panel. And so I thought, oh, they've thought to engage Indigenous folks in this. So it put me a bit at ease. My second interview, it got even better. I walked in and there were sacred medicines, tobacco, sage, cedar, sweetgrass were on the table. There was an Indigenous elder that offered me the medicines, and we had a smudge, and there was an Indigenous community member, a leader who I also recognized from community. And so a couple of different things. It showed me the organization was taking this seriously, because that was not the norm for the City of Toronto interviews. Smudging in a boardroom in City Hall, definitely at that time not the norm for the City of Toronto. It also, just as an Indigenous potential employee, just calmed me. I mean, it was the medicines, but it was also seeing the people and being in circle with them, including an elder, and that it made a huge difference for both my perception of the city, but also just my personal approach and feelings. And so I was put more at ease and felt much more comfortable than if it was, you know, a very myself on one side of the table and 5 people on the other, as we often see in interviews. It really made a difference for, like I said, for me and what I thought of the organization. I think it's really important to have Indigenous folks as part of an interview panel. assessing Indigenous people, potential Indigenous candidates, because we tend to pick up on nuances that non-Indigenous folks may not. I'll share a couple of examples, and they're related to storytelling and humility. So recognizing there's a huge amount of diversity amongst Indigenous peoples, as I tried to show in earlier slides. Still, many of us, many Indigenous folks, come from a long line of oral tradition and storytelling. Verbal, we talk a lot, that's how we share information. And you can see that in how some Indigenous candidates respond to questions. So they may talk for quite some time, and you may be tempted to look at your watch. You may have a hard time getting to what they're actually saying because they haven't gone 1, 2, 3 as an example. So the hiring panel has to work really hard. You have to be patient. It takes more time with those candidates. The main message might not be obvious, so you have to dig a little bit and listen to understand more than you might with the non-Indigenous folk. It's really about finding the meaning behind the meaning because of that oral tradition and that storytelling approach. And there was, she's still employed at the province. I was the only Indigenous person on a hiring panel. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago, and we were hiring a negotiator to work in Indigenous relations to actually negotiate with First Nations where treaties had not been adhered to. We sit down, the Crown tries to sit down and figure out ways to right past wrongs. And we had this amazing Indigenous candidate. She was obviously an excellent storyteller and orator. And the 2 non-Indigenous colleagues, wonderful people. It's not, they're good in their hearts. They just weren't used to sitting and listening to the stories, and they wanted to dismiss that candidate. And I had to push really hard and champion that Indigenous candidate. And we ended up hiring her, and she is probably one of, if not the strongest negotiator that is working in that particular area in the province right now. And we could have lost, never had that opportunity to work with her, and she would have never had that opportunity to do the good work that she's doing in community. And then I said, so that's storytelling. I said humility. This is one that I struggle with a lot. One of the teachings that many of us, many Indigenous folks, especially First Nations and Métis, get from a very early age is the importance of community and the importance of the collective. And we have to be humble, humble, humble. It is never about us. It is about what are we doing for community? What are we doing for the collective? And so I statements are really not in our vernacular. It's really difficult for us to identify what we've done because it's never about me as an individual. It's about we. And that, traditionally, hiring panels, hiring managers are looking for those I statements, looking for what does that individual do? What can that individual bring to the table? And of course, you're still looking for that. You just have to dig a little bit harder with, again, practice patience with Indigenous candidates, because they'll find it very challenging to say, I did this, I did that. It's because the humility is so part of our upbringing in many cultures, Indigenous cultures. I have actually been passed over for a number of jobs in the 24 years because I couldn't, it was so challenging for me to switch my language and the framing. So I know that was a challenge. I ended up getting a non-Indigenous coach to try and teach me how to say I statements. It still was a challenge, but I had to take a lot of extra steps in order to conform to a non-Indigenous approach versus the approach making more space for the way I've been taught and the way I've been raised. Okay. All right, so imagine you've hired an Indigenous person. They've just started. How do you keep them? What do you do to mobilize and develop them? Those are really important questions that you'll need to think if you want to grow your Indigenous workforce. There's lots of different things you can do. First and foremost, you can ask. Remember that Indigenous people and our cultures and languages are diverse. And so what one Indigenous employee wants may be different than what another Indigenous employee wants and needs. For some, they may want benefits and approach may differ. So this is one example. Some may need an extended leave for ceremonies. So if a community, as an example, if a community member passes away, some Indigenous nations have week or 2 week long grieving ceremonies. That typically doesn't fit within the standard days off if there's been a death in the family. Benefit plans don't always include access to elders and knowledge keepers, and we place a lot of value on speaking with elders and knowledge keepers as part of our health and well-being. And we don't want to go to those elders and knowledge keepers without offering a gift or something monetary, but often, again, benefit plans don't necessarily cover that. They look very narrowly at how healthcare is defined. I would also say, don't tokenize the Indigenous employee, that individual. You run the risk of them becoming the go-to for anything related to Indigenous, even though it might not have anything to do with their job. So just be cautious of tokenizing. And also ask yourself if the workplace is welcoming of Indigenous cultures and ways of being. I mentioned before offering of medicine. So can medicines be offered in the workplace? Do you have to go outside to offer them? What does that look like? If you want, maybe I can pause for a minute. If you aren't familiar with smudging or medicines, that there's 4 different sacred medicines. They're burned at different times and have different medicinal purposes. There's different teachings depending on what nation you're from as well, but generally speaking, 4 different medicines and different purposes. And generally, they promote a good heart and a good mind so that you'll have a productive day or a productive meeting. And so you'll often find, and we do this in the Indigenous Affairs Office, that we start meetings offering medicines so that we make sure that we're centered and grounded and there for one another and to do the best work possible in that particular moment. But if that practice of lighting a little bit of smoke is not acceptable, whether you run the risk of setting off a fire alarm or what's happened to colleagues at the city and happened to myself, some people think the medicine smells like marijuana. So instead of realizing that they're sacred, they make snarky comments about why does it smell like marijuana in Selina's office. Other things to think about, does the organization have a network for Indigenous employees? So this is quite common in the public service and can have a very positive impact on Indigenous employees. It offers another type of community in the workplace so they can gather with other First Nations, Métis, and Inuit staff, and they feel a sense of belonging and safety in that space. And they're with people that have had and are having similar experiences. So employee reference or resource groups, networks, they're called a lot of different things, but that an organization having that kind of space and adequately supporting and resourcing those networks can have a very positive impact. And one other question, and then I'll share another personal experience. Do you see other Indigenous folks? So if I'm a new Indigenous employee, I'm looking to see if there's other Indigenous folks in a variety of positions and roles, and that includes at the senior level. And so it was actually 16 years into my career. This is, I mean, Ingrid knows this and I raised it earlier. I purposely hid my identity for those 16 years because I'd seen how Indigenous employees were treated at the federal and provincial governments. I also had strong messages from family just to be quiet and, you know, you be Métis outside of the office. But in the office, just do your work. And so I, like a good Métis, I listened to my family and I listened to my elders. As you can imagine, that can have a really negative impact if you're not able to bring your whole self to work. And it did. It started to have a pretty negative impact on my health and well-being. But I still was not sure and not really ready to out myself, if you will. And then I had the opportunity to meet with and talk with 2 senior Indigenous leaders in the Ontario Public Service. And it was in the forming of an employee circle, an Indigenous employee network. Seeing those 2 Indigenous women who had more senior roles than I had at the time gave me a lot of hope. Having that Indigenous circle helped me feel more comfortable at work. And I started to talk about my identity. And over time, I talked a lot. And then I ended up, kind of shifting my career to where I now bring more than my whole self to work. But I really do, it was, for me anyways, it was seeing other Indigenous folks in senior positions, and it was having a safe space within the organization I was working in to have conversations and to see my place, to talk about challenges, talk about opportunities and successes. That made a big difference for me in my career. And last but not least, on this slide, one thing that I have seen for many Indigenous employees is our focus on community. We really want to be connected with community. We want to support community. And so does the employer, what most Indigenous folks, or at least many Indigenous folks, are looking for, will the employer give me an opportunity to do that? If it's not part of my role, how might I, as an Indigenous employee, achieve that, have that connection to community? And that's really always on the forefront of many Indigenous employees. So it's something, something to really consider. I have seen, unfortunately, the flip side of that, where some leaders in organizations don't want an Indigenous person leading Indigenous work because they don't feel that they can be unbiased. And we can have a long conversation about that, but Indigenous employees are actually kept away from what would actually help them thrive, and that is working directly with community in a good way. Just because you have an Indigenous person in an organization working with community doesn't mean they're going to go against the organization. There can be mutual benefits, and you could have a really amazing, engaged employee who's excited to do what you want to do with the Indigenous community and beyond. So I think this is my, oh, look at that. I thought I had one more slide, but I lied. This is the slide I mentioned earlier that has just additional links and opportunities if you want to keep learning. And I'll make sure you get a copy of this. And finish off, Marcy is thank you in my language. These are Lenape, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee ways of saying thank you. And I'm happy to take more questions, comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Selina. That was, wow, that's amazing. A lot. It's very involved. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with the HR group? Like where is there programming? I mean, I know about recruitment and retention, but what about other things? How do you raise awareness? I'm sure at a big organization, there are people who are not receptive to your message.
That's true.
How do you change hearts and minds? I mean,
So the changing hearts and minds takes time. Thankfully, when I started at the city, there was enough of what I call a coalition of the willing that wanted, so staff throughout the organization in every department that wanted to see change. And so you elevate that coalition of the willing, if you will. Mm-hmm. And you also acknowledge that learning is a journey, getting to reconciliation is a journey. And so people are at different places on that journey, and you got to meet people where they are. And so it's trying to meet people where they are and then figure out how to advance them in a reasonable way. When it comes to working with people in equity, we have, before I even got to the city, there was an Aboriginal employment strategy that was developed by Indigenous partners and passed by City Council. Mm. Unfortunately, it sat around and wasn't implemented. And so I am now working with staff in HR and strategic recruitment, which is our HR division, and people in equity to implement that, working really closely with community and recruitment to figure out how we take a strategy that's still relevant. All of the vision, everything is there. We just need action and need to change. Part of it is having conversations and living our values. So the City of Toronto has a motto, diversity, our strength. Mm. Great motto. But if you look at Indigenous employees and the Indigenous community, if you just do the numbers game, they're about 3 or 4% of the Toronto Public Service staff complement overall in the whole organization. 3 or 4% should be Indigenous if we want our public service to reflect the community that we're there to serve. 3 or 4%. And we're at about 0.2%. So it is about targeted recruitment and figuring out new programs, new partnerships. So we're launching into a new opportunity with Ms. Beek, the Aboriginal Employment Strategy, to try and recruit some new individuals. It's about thinking where Indigenous employees are and are not, and what else can we do? Like, what specific programs could we develop? Is it an internship like we did at the province, or is it, and we have started to do this in some of our programs. We are actually, if we're hiring, let's say 30 people into a particular employment program, well, 5 of those have to go to First Nations, Métis, or Inuit individuals. So looking at targets as well, to be quite honest. And then the other big piece, and this is, I see it as how the organization moves forward. I also see it as how you retain Indigenous employees, is that education and awareness. So it's not yet mandatory. We haven't had to make it mandatory because it sells out every time we offer it, but we consistently offer an Indigenous cultural competency training that we rolled out when the office created. And it's to give people a better understanding. I mean, you just got a very few slides snapshot. This is a full day of training led by an Indigenous knowledge keeper and elder who talk about the history, who talk about the oppression, talk about the issues and how they've manifested in Indigenous communities and the trauma that we still experience. And then what does that mean for the clients you serve, the colleagues you have at the city? And we have a pretty frank conversation as part of that learning. And so, and we're building on, that's a very, awareness building foundational piece of learning. And we're building on that, building out an Indigenous education strategy for the Toronto Public Service. Because we need to have a better understanding, both for externally, the clients, but also internally to support those, all the great Indigenous talent that the city is going to be hiring.
We only have about 2 minutes. Does anybody have a question for Selina? I'll throw it out to the group. I'm sure people have lots of questions, but they're probably thinking, there's not much time. Anybody? Ask away. I mean, I have a million questions, but no, I think because we're so out of time, Selina, your content was so unbelievable. I think that people don't know what to ask, and there's a lot to take in. I did have a question though from way back at the beginning, when you said ask people how they want to be referred to. So I'm meeting you. Yeah. What should I say to you then? How do I ask? How do you want to be referred to?
Literally what you just said.
Okay.
How do you identify? Or I'm not sure about what language to use. What language matters to you? Yeah.
Yeah, and does that and so in terms of identification, is that, do you want to be identified by place? Do you want to be identified by which group do you connect with? And
yeah, you can ask. I mean, what nation are you from? What community are you from? So I would say, well, I'm from the Meadow Lake Métis community in northwestern Saskatchewan. You can. What culture do you identify with? Different ways of asking the same thing.
Yeah, I guess the key is just to be doing the asking.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people will forgive if we don't ask perfectly. Yeah. The idea is that we're at least asking.
Exactly. When somebody tries to ask me, I am over the moon, because the fact that you're even marginally thinking about that tells me a good thing about your heart.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. I think for a lot of us, and I said this to Courtney last week, because it's so fraught, we may not ask because we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that we don't say anything at all.
And that also translates into action, and I've seen it in multiple organizations. We get so worried about doing the wrong thing we don't do.
Yeah.
And we don't want that. We want to make things better for Black employees, Indigenous employees, right? And if we don't ask, and we don't, you know, if fear is paralyzing us, then we can't actually take the steps that we need to make things better.
But I think what you said is key, right? That if you don't know, then just ask for guidance. Don't try to figure it out. Just say, I don't know what to do. Can you help?
Yeah, and I tell people, because this learning about Indigenous people, Indigenous relations is fraught with guilt, because people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this. Well, the education system is a colonial system. Like, you intentionally were not taught this. It's not your fault. I tend to think of people are naturally good, and you don't know of no fault of your own. And so asking questions, finding ways to learn, that's a good thing. And as guilty as some people can feel when they start to hear about the atrocities that have happened to Indigenous folks over the years, yeah, it's not your individual fault.
Yeah, that's a great point. And some people don't know what they don't know. So yeah, that's a great perspective. Gives everybody permission to at least wade in a little bit, right?
Yeah, we need more people to wade in.
Yes, this has been really fantastic. I'm so grateful. Maybe we could do it again at a different time so we can get a bigger group together. And I've recorded this, so I am going to upload this probably later today onto LinkedIn. And I would really be grateful if people would share this around and encourage people to watch what Selina has put out, you know, your slides, because it's really amazing, Selina. I mean, it's just great information, and I feel like it's just part one. Feels like there's more. There's just so much more.
Learning is never ending. Unlearning is also never ending.
Yeah. This has really been, you know, and I didn't even know that this office existed in the city. So there, you know, it's one of those best kept secrets. I guess the city doesn't talk about it.
Well, my boss would tell you that's my fault because I'm too humble. And so I don't talk enough about what we're doing.
Well, also the politicians don't talk about it either. You know, or each of our counselors, city councilors don't talk about it either. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Selina. I'm very grateful. And we'll have you back. We'll do it again.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.